Anger and protests in Bolivia after Jeanine Anez declares herself interim leader. Has the departure of Evo Morales ended the crisis or opened a new chapter? And what role are regional and world powers playing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zidan. Bolivia's leadership is in turmoil. The president has quit and fled, and his replacement doesn't have the government's full approval. Senate leader Jeanine Anez has declared herself interim president, but is fiercely opposed. Backers of former President Evo Morales boycotted the vote, making congressional approval impossible. Anez claimed the post anyway. Her critics are calling it a coup, but the US is supporting her. Mariana Sanchez has more from La Paz.
Protesters clashed with police and the army on the streets of Bolivia. Live rounds were shot. Tear gas didn't dispel angry Bolivians who demanded interim President Jeanine Anez to resign. On her first day in office, she's facing a country in turmoil. Social and political disputes are battled all around, including the National Assembly. On Wednesday, some of Evo Morales' mass party members tried entering Congress. Adriana Salvatierra had resigned from the Senate's presidency. She tried to come back, but police blocked the way.
This government is trying to portray the coup d'etat as a natural thing. We're legislators and we need to go to the assembly.
On the other side of the barricade, Morales' foes shouted fraud at adversaries, a reminder of what sparked the political crisis that forced President Evo Morales to resign. The interim president is relying on security forces to restore law and order. She appointed military commanders before the cabinet.
Taking up command of the armed forces at a crucial time for the state to bring this stage to an end and for new elections.
The interim president has said that she wants to bring peace back to the streets of the country, and that means that police will continue their patrols with the army.
Stability, naming a new electoral court and calling on new elections in December is the priority of the transitional government. But analysts say nothing can be done without negotiating with Morales' supporters.
The president must begin a dialogue because the MAS party is a reality, whether people like it or not. Otherwise, if there's no dialogue, we're lost.
From his refuge in Mexico, former President Morales pledged to return.
If my people ask for it, we're ready to go back to pacify the country, but national dialogue is important. Otherwise, it would be difficult to stop this confrontation.
In the capital, some roadblocks were removed and stores opened after weeks of near shutdown, but just for a short time. Thousands of angry Bolivians were back on the streets early, a reminder of just how far Bolivia is from coming out of the crisis. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, La Paz, Bolivia.
All right, let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us via Skype from Sucre, Wim Kamerbeek-Romero, political analyst and advisor to the left-leaning Chuquisaca Somos Todos party in Sucre. In Moscow, Dimitri Babbage, political analyst at Rossiya Sevodnya, a news media agency. Dimitri is also a specialist on Latin America. And on Skype again from Cochabamba in Bolivia, Kathryn Ledebur, director of the Andean Information Network, a political and social justice think tank. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Wim, does it look like Jeanine Anez will now be able to take over and be in control of Bolivia?
Well, good morning. No, I don't think so, actually. There is a lot of irregularities in this process. She assumes as a president without a quorum in the assembly. And yes, of course, we're not talking about a coup properly. It's not like the definition of a coup, but there is a lot of things that indicate that this is not really a democratic process. So Jeanine Anez, yes, she is a woman, and yes, it might be really like an advance for women's rights here in Bolivia, but I don't think that it's really representing what we are thinking. I mean, this is a right-wing politician coming from the eastern side of the region of Bolivia, and yes, so I don't really think if she is representing the democratic issues here in Bolivia, but she is representing like the conservative visions of politics. What I'm trying to say is that when she assumes as a president, she does it with a Bible in her hand and with a discourse about getting God back to the government. So it's I think it's very concerning because democracy in Bolivia is really fragile right now, and yes, I think she is not really going to negotiate with the MAS party and the assembly.
All right.
And I think
let me bring in the perspective, I guess, the counter perspective, and maybe take that to Kathryn. Given all the resignations, the narrative goes, she's simply the next one in line and throne.
I disagree with that completely. That's an inaccurate assessment. I agree with my colleague in Sucre that her positioning of herself, calling a legislative session without the presence of the, it was an empty chamber. It's important to note that the MAS party holds a 2/3 majority of both houses. According to the guidelines of both houses of Congress, any resignation has to be accepted by the plenary in the chambers. None of those things happened, nor does she have a right to become interim president. There are people in line in front of her, and this is a completely illegal process, rubber stamped by a constitutional tribunal ruling based on a prior constitution.
Let me jump in, if I may, though, Kathryn, and ask this question again from the counter perspective. Could any of that have happened? Could you have had an orderly resignation given the chaotic circumstances? The narrative goes, the president, fleeing Evo Morales, very quickly, claiming his life was being threatened, his home was being attacked. Was there the possibility to go through an orderly, constitutional, by the rules, by the book transition process?
Absolutely. President Morales and the vice president sent a formal letter to be considered on the floor of the Bolivian Congress in compliance with the legal regulations. This is absolutely possible. It's important to note that yesterday, MAS legislators tried to go into the Congress building, and they were beaten by police and tear gas and sustained multiple contusions. There was a later session where they appointed legally a new head of the lower house of Congress who would be, according to the Bolivian Constitution, legally in line.
Okay, and Kathryn, let me again ask, who's to blame for that process being aborted?
Which protest?
Well, was it the protesters on the streets, domestic forces, or do you see an outside hand in moving things in the direction of what some call a coup?
Well, Morales had agreed to comply with the results of the OAS audit. The OAS audit cited irregularities. He immediately called for new elections and a multi-party commission to develop a strategy to elect a new electoral tribunal. This did not stop the violence. This was the demand of the opposition. He had complied completely. The violence continues. Homes were attacked. Family members were attacked of politicians. Places were looted and burnt. It was a very violent process. And that is the people who are pushing that issue, they are to blame for this. There was retaliatory violence, but no respect for the rule of law on the part of the opposition.
Let me bring Dimitri Babbage into this discussion. Looking at things from maybe a global perspective, to what extent will outside forces and powers, whether they're in the region or global superpowers, have some influence, if not decide, on what happens next in Bolivia?
Well, I hope that this influence will be minimal because obviously Bolivians should decide their future themselves. And I can tell you that on the Russian side, there was certainly no involvement in this situation because Russia doesn't have business in Bolivia. Well, there is a small bilateral trade, but it is minuscule compared to the trade that Bolivia has with the United States or with China. Russia does have some commercial interests in Venezuela because it's an oil-rich country, and the leadership of this country invited Russian business and Russians in general in order to, cooperate and find alternative markets, alternative ways of development for Venezuela. So it's a very different story. Right now in Russia, there is a big discussion what exactly happened in Bolivia, because few people expected
Dimitri,
here
allow me to jump in
this
as well.
amount of
Why
violence
was Moscow so quick
and the
to
speedy
comment
departure
on
of
what
Mr.
was
Morales.
happening? Why was Moscow so quick to comment on what's happening in La Paz if, as you said, Russia really has no interest in what's going on there?
Well, we have no commercial interest, economic interest, but of course, ideologically, Russia is very concerned about what's going on in Latin America because obviously this is a very important region where small and not so small countries are now deciding whether they can develop independently of the United States and of other globalist influences. So Mr. Morales, he was popular in Russia. He visited Russia just recently. All Russia was very impressed with his success in developing small and medium enterprises, SMEs, in Bolivia. Economically, he was seen as a successful president. As for the fact that he stayed in power for 14 years, I think it's a huge hypocrisy on the side of the United States and some other countries to limit the amount of time that presidents can be in power. Let me remind you that Finland, which is the most economically successful country in the world, it was ruled by the same person, Urho Kekkonen, for 35 years, from the 50s to the early 80s.
Right,
and no one said that
Dimitri,
Finland was a failure, that he was a dictator.
We don't have a voice from the other side. So I'm going to try and play that devil's advocate on this show. I guess the question would be, or the suggestion or claim from the other side would be, it's one thing, if what happens in Finland happens according to the constitutional rules, but for many of the protesters, the way they see it, those who are opposed to Evo Morales, they felt the way that he was handling the question of presidential term limits wasn't going according to the constitution. Let me bring that point back to Wim and say, the way you characterized this was almost like there's a vast conspiracy here of people from the right wing and the religious groups which are making some kind of coup. But isn't the fact that there is support apparently from the military, the police, the Roman Catholic Church? I mean, does that make you question whether there is more broader support for this new administration of Anez, regardless of whether she did the transition in the right or wrong way?
Well, I'm not trying to justify what Evo Morales has said in the past days, that he is going to Mexico because of a coup. Teresa, let's stay with the big picture. There were a lot of irregularities in this past 6 months. And actually, since 2016, there is a lot of indications that the executive power has been intervening at the electoral power in order to benefit Evo Morales for a fourth postulation. And let's fix to the big picture. There is a authoritarian government from the MAS that is trying to stay in power for with any kind of manipulation. Let's try to stay with the big picture. There are two big blocks. I mean, the MAS on one side and the right wing politics on the other side that are trying to stay in power or to go to power at any way. Yes, there was a conspiration from the police in the past days trying to boycott the MAS because of some demands that the government didn't satisfy. But the thing is, why does the military say on Sunday, before Evo Morales is resigning, why does the military say we suggest Evo Morales to resign from the presidency? So there is a lot of questions that we don't get. We're not really getting the clear picture here about what really happened in Bolivia.
All right, well,
but we can
maybe
say
we should shift the question into looking forward and ask Kathryn, can the loyalists, the Morales loyalists in Congress now block? I mean, how much of a serious threat can they pose, do you think, to Jeanine Anez's ascent?
Well, that remains to be seen. Their position is legal and constitutional. It's important to note that you can't complain about an unconstitutional move from Morales on a fourth term and then justify that with unconstitutional attitudes and behavior, as the Anez group has done. It remains to be seen who will win this power play. But legally and constitutionally, the MAS bloc, the MAS Congress, and President Evo Morales, until his resignation is accepted, is legally president of Bolivia until the end of the constitutional elected term, which ends at midnight, January 22nd. So it's not clear what's going to happen. Very worrisome events with a new cabinet position, with a new government minister, Arturo Murillo, saying that he's going to hunt down anyone who's committed sedition, hunt down a former minister because he's an animal, systematic blocking of Chapari cocoa growers from entering Cochabamba City at gunpoint, being pushed against cars, handcuffed, photographed, registered, and sent back because they're not welcome in the city. None of this is legal. None of it's acceptable. It's a violation of due process and of basic human rights. And I think it's something that the international community needs to focus on. And
I'm glad you mentioned the international community, because that was going to be my next point. Let's take it to Dimitri. To what extent do you think we're going to see an appetite develop amongst some countries, not only Moscow, but Nicaragua and Mexico, for example, have condemned what they see as a coup. Uruguay condemning what they're calling the breakdown of law and order. Even Argentina's president saying, you know, we've gone back to the era of the 70s where military interventions take out popular governments with, as he's put it, US backing. Are we going to see some kind of regional divide, and how much of an appetite might arise for intervention in Bolivia, do you think, Dimitri?
Well, it's not a secret for anyone that the United States does not like Evo Morales personally. Let me remind you of that scandalous story, which happened, I think, in 2013, when the plane that was taking Evo Morales from Moscow, the Americans suspected that he could be carrying Mr. Snowden, Edward Snowden, the whistleblower from the NSA. They were concerned that Morales might be carrying him in his plane to Bolivia. So let me remind you that the plane with Morales was forced to land in Austria, and the plane was searched. And there was basically a threat to the life of Evo Morales and the plane's crew. So let me remind you that there was an emergency summit meeting of the Latin American presidents where this action of the United States was condemned. And you rightly point out that the same voices were heard there. Voices from Argentina, from Uruguay.
Will those voices turn into a call for action, do you think, or is that too far-fetched, Dimitri?
Latin America. So I think, obviously there are many people in Latin America, and there are many governments which are not happy about this trend. They suspect, rightly or wrongly, that Mr. Morales lost power because someone influenced or basically just bribed the army and the police. And that brings some very bad memories.
Okay.
How far will that go? I think it will depend on the United States. But let me remind you that Mr. Trump has openly called on the army of Venezuela to abandon the government there. So
right,
of course
that's
there is
been going on
concern.
in Venezuela.
I think there are reasons for concern.
If there's time, we'll come back to that point. But since we're getting short, I want to come back to Wim and say, what is the possibility of that this leads ultimately to a breakdown in the institutions of democracy if this goes on in a form that's deadlocked in the Congress, and perhaps even the return of Evo Morales?
Well, I don't think that Evo Morales is coming back anytime soon to Bolivia. But what I'm really sure is that the next elections in 90 days will not have a left party participating in elections. We'll have like some disputes between the right-wing parties in Bolivia. And that is really concerning because we will not have a plurality in democracy, which is a really important element of democracy. Yes, what we will see on the Congress is well, a big party, MAS, with the congressmen and women not really trying to negotiate something with Jeanine Anez or her party. And what we will see will be a really conflictive scenario in the assembly. What my big concern is that the left in Bolivia is going to it will have like a big work in the next years to reconstitute itself. So it's very concerning because the democracy right now, democracy as we can see it, like the constitution and everything, is only justifying one side of politics in Bolivia. And this one side is right-wing politics with Bibles, with religions, and putting in danger, for example, the secular state in Bolivia. So it's really concerning what is going to happen in the next years, because we are going to see like a competition between only only right-wing parties. That's really concerning.
What will happen to the left-wing parties then, I wonder, Kathryn? Is the suggestion on this show that they're going to be ejected from parliament and become somehow persona non grata in politics? And where does that leave the element we haven't mentioned so far, the ethnic divide in the country?
Well, I think it's important to note that this particular conflict and the tone that it has taken has increasingly deteriorated into the police destroying the Huipala symbol of the flag or the symbol of indigenous movements that predate Morales, many attacks on indigenous people, groups, far-right groups that use the Nazi salute, like the Santa Cruz Youth League and their former leader, who is now one of the main spokespeople on the right. It's important to note right now that MAS Congress members, MAS union leaders affiliated with MAS are facing death threats, repeated death threats, right, by telephone, by mail, publicly. So it's very important to understand that you first have to create a situation where there's a basic respect for the rule of law and human rights, because it's impossible to know in this context.
Forgive me, Kathryn, but I think we've got only a minute left. Let me quickly give the last perhaps 50 seconds to Dimitri and say, what is the risk here that this will unravel other places like Venezuela?
Well, I think there is a huge risk because, as our previous participant has said, if indeed all the leftist part of the political spectrum is removed, that is not going to pass unnoticed in other countries. A lot of people in Latin America will interpret it as a kind of a right-wing coup. So there can be a backlash. There can be a kind of a protest backlash, not only in Venezuela, where, as we see, the Western-supported candidate for presidency is nowhere to be seen, and we have a very embarrassing situation, but maybe also in other countries. People in Latin America do not want a remake of the 70s. That will be, I think, very sad if that remake is made by anyone.
Well, history often doesn't go the direction anyone thinks, so it'll be interesting to watch where it goes right now in the Americas. But thanks so much to our guests for coming and giving us their thoughts on this. Thanks to Kamerbeek-Romero, Dimitri Babbage and Kathryn Ledebur. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, just head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.